I'm recording. Watch your language.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a good wet weekend. Um, just wanted to mention a couple of people had some issues with the soils lab, and that was my fault. I, for whatever reason, didn't make it an assignment. I think I've got that fixed now. So if you can, just get on there and double check and make sure that that is an assignment and you can actually turn something into it rather than just a page where you don't get the option to turn anything in. But yeah, that soils lab is all about looking at the texture of soil and kind of describing some physical properties of soil. We'll kind of do another part of that lab here in the next week or so. Since I just put that up, I put the due date on it as 2 weeks. So you have a lot of time to do that lab. So it's not any major rush to do it, but you probably want to do it after the soil dries out a little bit. That way it's works a little bit better. It's easier to dig, doesn't damage the soil if you're digging in it. So you should have ample time to take care of that soils lab. And that is back on that, I think it's week 7 module, which we've come a ways so far. It seems like time has kind of flown by, but here we are in mid-October, which I alluded to before. It does mean that it's about time for a midterm kind of review exam. So I'm going to try to get that up this week, and I'll also give you all, probably a week or two to take that exam. It's going to be based off of the quizzes. Most of the questions will be taken from the quiz questions. They might be altered slightly, so do pay close attention to them. I am going to post a review though. The midterm will be different from the quizzes in that it's not open book, I should say. I mean, to be honest with you, it's if you have the book, you could open it and look at it. I'm not going to enable the webcam for that. If you want to, print off some study materials or whatever for that, then that's fine. I am going to do the lockdown browser option for that, so you won't be able to just go look at the quizzes themselves and get those answers. And it will be timed too, so it will give you a limit on the amount of time that you have to answer the questions. So we're looking at 50 questions worth 2 points each for that midterm exam, and look for that to be open probably by the end of the week. It won't be today. All right, so if you have questions or concerns about that, feel free to give me a shout. That will be pretty much everything we've talked to up to the structure of higher plants. So we won't include what we discussed this week on that midterm exam. Let's go ahead and get into our next chapter, chapter 7, looking at plant growth and development. And let me share the screen with you here. All right. So how do plants over time? Kind of define plant growth. We're thinking of it as, a measure of the increase of plant size. And we can look at that in terms of mostly fresh weight or height, usually is what we're looking at. But ideally, we really want to look at the harvestable portion of the crop. But either way, to actually define plant growth, we look at it as a size increase, really all of these measures together, which are resulting from just cell division and enlargement, as well as the creation of new cellular material and the organization of those subcellular organelles that we mentioned, those little bodies within the cell. And the changes of those as you develop from like a vegetative state to a reproductive state. So plants go through these stages of development, and what came first, the seed or the plant, right? The chicken or the egg. So if we look at that, we'll start off with seed germination. But that seed had to come from somewhere, right? But the seed germinates, and then, as we talked about in the last chapter, we have the um, embryo of the plant, kind of utilizing its energy that it's stored within that seed to push out the radicle, that kind of primordial root, and the plumule, that primordial shoot. And then from there, we have the growth of a vegetative stage of organs and tissues, the stems, the leaves, etc., the buds eventually. When we get into the second stage, which is the initiation and the maturation of all the reproductive parts. First, the flower buds, and then they open to the flowers themselves, develop based on how it's pollinated. They will be fertilized and then develop into either a fruit of some sort that contains the ovules that develop into the seed. So then we get seed develop and the maturing of the seeds themselves, and eventually the plant will senesce and die. Of course, that is depending on the life cycle of the plant. So those are the 4 stages of plant growth: from seed to shoot to fertilization to death. And in that life cycle, we're thinking of, that's the plant's goal, is to actually develop seeds, disperse them, ideally as far apart from the parent plant as possible. And then if it's an annual, it's going to die that same year. If it's perennial, it'll continue to do that. If it's a biennial, it won't actually get to this second stage of development of reproductive organs in the first year. It'll do it the second year. So we look at that as the stages of development, but it's important to note that that isn't necessarily kind of in equilibrium with the size of the plant. And kind of as we see here with this poinsettia, we've got one on the left that is much smaller but is in the reproductive stage, whereas one on the right is not yet developing the reproductive structures, like the flower bracts here, and then the flowers themselves in the poinsettia. And that's probably because poinsettias are photoperiod sensitive. They require a particular regime of light and darkness in order to get to that reproductive stage. More on that later when we get into the light. But first, thinking about how this happens, division of cells, the elongation and expansion of both the shoots and the roots, continuing shoot growth, and also the development of new tissues coming from these meristematic cells. And remember, we talked about the meristems as being those areas where cells are divided and differentiated into the different tissues, saying, all right, this is going to be a root, this is going to be a shoot, this is going to be a flower bud, etc. So we've got, again, meristem in the roots, meristem in the shoots, and then also in kind of the trunk or stem of, especially of woody plants, getting that secondary growth produced by the vascular cambium. And then in mature plants, the vegetative meristems will kind of convert into these reproductive meristems that are producing the flower parts and eventually the seeds, etc. So those are controlled by kind of changes in the actual internal chemistry of the plant. And that's all governed by the DNA, and specifically by the genes themselves. So the genes kind of held with chromosomes and the nucleus of the cell are directing the actual creation and then the use of each protein. And each protein is going to have a special function in the plant to make new parts as well. And when we look at this, the gene coding the protein, it's called a transcription factor. However, it's not just the gene cells. They are actually triggered by hormones. And hormones in plants are very similar to hormones in people. They are basically triggering the plant to change its chemistry in a way that it can move into the next stage of development. So we look at 4 classes of hormones as kind of most affecting plant growth and development. And we'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but they are auxins, gibberellins, cytokinins, and ethylene. And these hormones can be affected by the environmental factors, and they're going to work by activating and deactivating the gene transcription, so how those genes code for the proteins. So we'll come back to that whole hormone issue in a little bit, but for now, let's just think about how the environmental factors affect that and affect the stages of growth. And the first one, the primary kind of environmental factor that we think of to trigger photosynthesis is sunlight, energy from the sun. And I say sunlight, but of course it could also be artificial light. And we started to talk about this in a previous section where we were looking at that sunlight being this electromagnetic spectrum, and plants perceive the same that we do, the visible light, which is just this wavelength of 400 to 700 nanometers in that electromagnetic spectrum. And you probably remember that as thinking about it from the Roy G. Biv, the colors of the rainbow itself. And that spectrum is also called PAR, or photosynthetic active radiation. Plants are basically utilizing their growth and their tissues to most efficiently capture that light for photosynthesis. And that radiation that reaches the plant can either be absorbed by the plant or it can be reflected, which plants absorb red, orange, yellow. They reflect blue, indigo, and violet. Or I'm sorry, they're also absorbing blue, indigo, and violet. They're reflecting green. So that's why they appear green to us. And then as we get into the autumn, you've got the chlorophyll actually dying and the chloroplasts revealing the true color of the plants, the other spectrums that they've absorbed in those chloroplasts. So more on that later, but getting into the light, finding the light, right? So looking at the angle of incidence, and that is of which a beam of light reaches a plant or the Earth's surface. And the maximum amount of light is reached at this angle of incidence of 90 degrees. So ideally when the sun is directly overhead, which only happens for a brief part of the day, brief parts of the season, that we get that. In kind of controlled environment agriculture, we try to set up that angle of incidence so to where it's always at 90 degrees. As the angle decreases or increases from 90 degrees, then we get more light being reflected or refracted than being absorbed. So that's just important to think about for the development of the plant. We want to try to maximize that angle of incidence. And the way that plants actually perceive light is looked at by a couple of different measures. We look at the intensity of the light itself being able to directly affect the plant's photosynthesis, as well as the amount of light that actually is absorbed by the plant in the chlorophyll and then goes into the photosynthesis. And we'll also look at the quality and quantity of light, kind of based on that as well. You've probably been familiar with how sunflowers move to absorb the maximum amount of light and kind of maintain that angle of incidence. And they do through these heliotrope, and the genus and species of sunflower, Helianthus annus, helio coming from heliotropic movements. Helio is the sun, right? So the sunflowers actually move their leaves and flowers to, basically absorb the greatest amount of sunlight. And that heliotropic movement is just one example of a way that plants respond to light. So we look at light quality, just the actual relative quantity of the individual component wavelengths of a beam of light itself. So thinking about that, it actually has more of an effect kind of on the vegetative and reproductive cycles of plants. This is really important in the controlled environment agriculture, to match the spectrum coming from artificial lights to whatever stage of development the life cycle of the plant is in. So blue light is better for vegetative production. Red light is more important for flower production. So, but those are just different parts of that wavelength. They're all necessary to complete the life cycle of the plant. Either way, light quality, we're looking at just the spectrum and the individual component wavelengths of light. So light is also affecting the plant's growth and development through that photomorphogenesis, of which that heliotropic movement is an example. Photomorphogenesis is basically just how light is affecting the plant's shape or form. And it's different in each stage of development, how the plant responds to that. They need just the right amount of light. They don't want too much, they don't want too little. You gotta have that Goldilocks amount at every stage. And if you have too much or too little, then you have these photomorphogenic responses, which could be like the plant stretching for light, or could be even sunburn, or sun scald, we usually call it in the plant world, but it's really just sunburn of plants. So for light quality, another thing that we might look at is the ratio of red to far red. So red light is within the spectrum, far red light is just out of that PAR spectrum. Red is efficiently absorbed by the chlorophyll, whereas the far red light is transmitted or reflected. So we look at that red to far red ratio as basically a way to kind of judge stretch of plants. Ideally, we want kind of a lower ratio, kind of like a 1-to-1 ratio. As it gets more to the far red, you get more stretch in plants, more legginess. And that red to far red ratio is going to decline dramatically as light penetrates the leaf canopy. So any plants that are beneath that canopy, or plant parts that are beneath that canopy, are not getting as much of that red light, which causes them to stretch more. And that's important for kind of the ending yield of the crop. I think it's more important though for the ornamental plants. We don't usually want to see as much stretch because it is not as aesthetically pleasing. So that's part of the light quality conundrum. they get increased height, reduced branching, and smaller stem diameters as that kind of far red light increases and the red light decreases. And in some cases, extreme cases, the chlorophyll synthesis will decline and cause the plant to be pale and sometimes even chlorotic, where it looks like it's bleached out almost. Even if it has the proper soil nutrition, this can still happen, which stresses the plant, makes it more susceptible to things like pest infestation, and just makes a less desirable plant in terms of aesthetics, like these petunias here. Which plant looks best to you? So on the right here, we've got a plant that was grown under a filter that blocked the far red light, so it ended up being nice bushy plant. So it has a high red to lower far red ratio, and in some cases that's preferred. The plant in the center here is under normal sunlight, and the one on the left is kind of the opposite ratio, lower red to higher far red, which has caused it to stretch. Different applications for these different plants, but I think the one in the center and the one on the right definitely look better personally. All right, so we look at light quality also as a chemical response. They call these cryptochromes, these molecules that are involved in these photomorphogenic responses, and also to a greater extent kind of circadian rhythm. It's development throughout the day and its responses through the day. Let me skip through most of this here and kind of look at what we're getting into right now, a little bit of autumn syndrome, which you can actually see in a lot of woody plants, where we get this visible photoperiodic response from this kind of difference in light as the day length dramatically decreases after the autumnal equinox. And so this autumn syndrome is looked at as this series of processes that includes kind of the plants preparing for winter. So it will acquire this kind of freeze tolerance and start to send the buds and into kind of dormancy. So it'll develop next year's leaf buds, and eventually it'll cause the drop of leaves in the deciduous trees. So dormancy in this case for these woody perennial plants is just this temporary ending of growth, pausing of it really, and that's going to be induced by short days, which is partially responsible for the color changes in the leaves, and then definitely responsible for the dropping of leaves themselves. So of course for annual plants we can also see this to a lesser degree, but it's more controlled just by the plant's stage of development rather than for perennial plants, these that live many years, looking at a way to prepare it to go dormant. So it is induced by these short days that we're experiencing right now. So probably starting to see some changes in yours there, with starting with the color of leaves, and in some cases maybe even some leaf fall. In the perennial world for herbaceous plants, they are going to survive the winter by forming and putting energy into roots and kind of the specialized stem structures that are underground, things like tubers and rhizomes. So they're somewhat protected by being underground, insulated by the soil, so that they can spring back in the spring and kind of regrow. So another important thing to look at in terms of the day length and the photo period is how that can affect certain plants. And a good example is onions. So this table right here is looking at the effect of day length on just the formation of the bulbs of onions in different cultivated varieties. And onions are split up between short day, day neutral, and long day varieties. For us in the mid-Atlantic, we can really kind of grow either, but at higher latitudes, you want to grow more long day onions because they have longer days in the summer. At lower latitudes, they get shorter days, so they need to grow short day onions. Also depending on what season you're growing them in too. So let's also talk about how temperature plays a role in the development of plants, and really how we've talked about how frost is kind of our basically controlling our growing season, but in between the frost, the final frost in the spring and the first frost in the fall, in that growing season, plants are governed by these changes in temperature, of course, and all plants have an optimal temperature to get the maximum vegetative growth, as well as flowering, fruit production, etc. And we can kind of look at those as generally, where did that plant come from? So most of our temperate region plants, things that are kind of native to our part of the world, are going to grow anywhere between about 39 degrees is when they start growing, and they'll grow up to into the 80s, 90s. Sometimes plants will slow down in the 90s, but their optimum is kind of closer to 50 degrees. Higher temperatures can have negative effects on the plant. It can cause some sunburn, some sun scald of leaves and other tissues. And that can be exacerbated by things like low humidities and high winds. Of course, at low temperatures, plants are also, and of course, the most common and easily seen is frost, the first frost coming here in the fall. We've actually had a few light frosts, and you can see the damage from that. It's a really good time to go out and just look at plants, especially those that you're growing. A lot of our annual plants that we grow in our gardens might have come from tropical places, so they're really susceptible to that frost. When the frost settles on the leaves, these ice crystals are basically causing this expansion of that cytoplasm and the rupturing of the cells, which allows that cytoplasm and water to flow out and basically kills the cells of the plants that are susceptible to it. So we can avoid frost damage to some extent by preventing radiant heat transfer from the leaves to the sky. And that'll happen naturally from cloud cover, but we use things like row cover, just a kind of polyester that we put on top of plants to protect them as well. Also, low temperatures can just, even if it's not in frost, they can just do some damage to especially the tropical plants, kind of stump them, slow them down. They can also do some good. They induce different processes and have different cues to coordinate plant growth and development. So usually we're looking at very low temperatures for this. And one of the things that it affects is seeds. So seeds are still living. They're just dormant versions of the plant, right? So they have that living embryo inside of them. And in some cases, the embryo needs to go through some of these cold-induced changes, also known as stratification, before they can germinate. And stratification is just a period of time, and that can be long or it can be short, where it has to remain cold and moist. We'll do that sometimes by putting seeds in the freezer. We don't really need to do this for most of our crop plants. We just need to do it for a lot of the native plants, especially those that are native to the temperate regions. you're kind of simulating what they would go through naturally. Of course, you could just leave seeds outside and let them go through that naturally, but it's going to be a little bit more irregular than it would be. And kind of naturally, these native plants are putting out tons and tons of seeds, and very few of them are actually, make it and grow. Whereas we improve that germination by stratifying them kind of artificially. Can also induce flowering through a process known as vernalization. And this is really important for biennial plants because it triggers them to kind of change the chemistry of the plant to get that meristem to trigger to go into the reproductive stage. So most of our biennials will just grow vegetatively the first year, and then they're going to kind of go dormant. But then they have to have this particular period of vernalization, a certain number of days below a certain temperature, in order to basically trigger the meristem and the hormone to develop the floral and reproductive parts. So that's vernalization, which vernal coming from spring, think of like the vernal equinox. It's preparing it for the next growing season. And a good example of that would be garlic, which if you guys are growing garlic, now is the time to get ready to plant it. And for us, kind of in Southwest Virginia, we have to kind of play this game where we wait until it's cooler, usually kind of in late October, sometime around Halloween, but we have to get them in the ground before it gets too moist to work the soil. So for us, that's sometime usually around mid-November. Generally in October, it tends to be more on the dry side around here. And then in November, it starts getting moist, and then the ground doesn't dry out as easily. So it's much more difficult to work the soil without damaging it. So for garlic, that vernalization period is 40 days under 40 degrees that it has to have in order to trigger it to develop from kind of that clove of garlic to develop a shoot, and then actually eventually develop a new head of garlic. Another thing that we can see is as a response of temperature, lower temperatures as a good thing is just dormancy breakage. And many of the woody plants, especially our fruit trees, will have a chilling requirement. Actually knew some people that were trying to grow apples in a greenhouse, and of course it didn't work because they didn't get that chilling requirement. They have to go through a certain, same as the garlic, certain number of days below a certain temperature to develop the buds properly to where they can break dormancy in the spring. And if they don't do that, they won't ever develop the reproductive parts. They might open leaf buds, but they won't ever develop into flower buds. All right, another environmental factor, of course, is water. The bulk of the plant is water, and the plant requires water to maintain this turgidity in the cells that allows the plants to, stand up. So one thing that we can do to kind of somewhat alter the development of plants, maybe keep them bushier, shorter, is to withhold water during the times when the stems are growing longer. So this is called drying down, and it's not the easiest technique to use, because you don't want to dry it down too much to where it's going to have a negative effect and cause the plant to wilt, but just giving it just enough moisture to continue to maintain itself without really elongating the stem that much. This drying down strategy is, I don't think it's not really frequently used in many forms of like field agriculture, but it is used in some kind of more specialized forms, especially in the kind of ornamental horticulture world. Along with water, we have, air, of course, and plants need CO2 for photosynthesis. and they're going to release oxygen, but they also need oxygen in the root zone. And the stomata, the opening and closing of the stomata themselves are going to be regulated in part just by the levels of carbon dioxide. So back to the controlled environment agriculture, they actually have to oftentimes pump in CO2 to make sure they have enough to open and regulate growth. Because this opening and closing of the stomata allows for transpiration and respiration, and that allows for the plants to grow. Oxygen is important in respiration of all plants, whether that is root growth, but also as driving the kind of biochemical reactions needed for growth and development in the plant. And we'll talk about that in much more detail in the coming chapter. All right, so let's go back to the seed and kind of look at its kind of cycle and stages of development. Starts off with imbibition, where the seed is actually just taking up water, imbibing water. And then it's going to increase its biological activity inside. The embryo is becoming more active. It's utilizing those foods stored in the tissues. And then we get emergence of the root and shoot. So 3 stages there for germination, pretty simple. In the imbibition stage, basically, just think of it as taking up water and the seed itself increasing in size because the cells are swelling. So yeah, that's kind of the first stage, and that leads to everything else. That is the most important thing in the germination stage, is that it gets the water that it receives at the right temperature to break out of that dormancy. Here's just an example of how we kind of might change the growth patterns of a plant. There are multiple techniques here in order to get kind of an ornamental form, more aesthetically pleasing for particular types of plants, like on the left here, bonsai, or on the right here, kind of good, well-rounded sedum ornamental. So generally, for agriculture, we want vigorous vegetative growth, other than really just in the ornamental world. So when we get into vegetative stage of development, seed is imbibed, germinated. We're getting into the growth of the plant. First, let's look underground at the functions of the roots itself, which are kind of common sense. We all know what the roots do, right? They anchor the plants in the soil, they absorb water and mineral nutrients, and then they move that into the plant and throughout the plant. And later on, they're going to store energy, carbohydrates that they might use to regrow from, especially in the case of the biennials like beets and carrots. Some cases we also use roots for vegetative reproduction and propagation. And plants use them naturally, kind of the specialized forms, like in the case of the rhizome. There's always some sort of balance between the root system and the shoot as well. As the top of the plant grows larger, then generally there's going to be an increase in the root system as well. And to kind of keep it at equilibrium, and that's mostly because as the plants grow and develop more leaves, you have more water loss throughout the leaves from transpiration. On shoot growth, it can either be determinate or indeterminate depending on the genetics of the plants. And determinate is basically saying that it's got a period where it's going to grow to a certain height and stop. Indeterminate just continually grows. So some examples of that would be like in tomatoes, and kind of the vining type tomatoes are indeterminate. And course, we have both indeterminate and determinate varieties of tomatoes out there, a vining type versus a bushing type. We have the same for beans. You grow green beans, you got a pole bean, which is indeterminate, and a bush bean, which is determinate. So it's genetics controlling that pattern of growth. And so in general, the determinate plants have a shorter lifespan, shorter life cycle, and most of the harvestable product is ready kind of around the same time. Whereas indeterminate, they grow throughout the season and produce throughout the season as well. Over here on the right, poinsettias have a determinate pattern, and that is also somewhat controlled by the photoperiod as well. But they're going to grow to a certain height, and then they're going to be able to produce flowers and kind of go on the next stage as long as that photoperiod is correct. So we've alluded a couple of times to the life cycles of plants. Again, there's 3 of them. We start with annuals, which complete their life cycle in one growing season. And the funny thing is that a lot of our crops, of course, are not from here. We're taking them out of their origin and domestication. And in doing so, we're making them grow in our climate as annuals, even though they might be perennials in their native climate. So one example is of tomatoes. Tomatoes growing in their kind of center of origin, say in the Amazon, they are perennials there. But we grow tomatoes here in Virginia. We are confined because we're a temperate region. We're going to have cold temperatures. And because of that, we grow them as an annual. So there are native plants that are annuals, and there are native plants that are perennials. Most of our crops, though, we grow as annuals, and they complete their life cycle in one growing season. Of course, with some exceptions to that. So here's just a look at the life cycle events of a typical annual. Seeds planted, it's germinated, it emerges, it goes through vegetative growth for a certain number of days where it's producing leaf and stem tissues. And then it makes flower buds for a certain period. And then the flowers actually open, and then it goes into that fully reproductive stage where they're not growing nearly as much vegetatively. Some plants are growing some still vegetatively, but they're mostly putting their energy into reproduction. Then they're fertilized, they form the embryo, we get fruit and seed maturity, and then the plants die. Biennials require 2 growing seasons, but not necessarily 2 years to complete their life cycle. Because really, as long as they get the right environmental cues that trigger it to go to the next cycle, it doesn't have to be necessarily 2 years. So if you planted it really early in the spring, it might be able to go through that and reach maturity by the fall. If you plant it more in the summer, then usually they will go a second year, kind of go through that dormancy period. But again, basically, they're going to grow vegetatively. And usually that looks like a kind of a basal rosette, a little kind of leaves at the base of the plant at the ground. And then they're really producing a lot of root system. And they take that energy, move it into develop the second season, into going into kind of the reproductive stage. So carrots are a good example of biennials. We grow them, though, as annuals, because we're going to harvest them before they go into that next cycle. Because when they do, they're going to change that morphology and chemistry of the plant, and the root itself, that taproot that we harvest for the carrot, is going to become woody. So if we're growing carrots for seed, then we grow them truly as biennials, but otherwise we kind of treat them more like annuals. Here's an example in the flowering world. Hollyhocks, Alcea rosea, as this basal rosette in the first year. And then the second year, they change dramatically. So they go from this, plant that might be, 24 inches or less tall to something that can be, up to 8 feet tall in some cases when it flowers and goes to seed. Exposure to the chilling temperatures are going to trigger the hormonal changes, but also lead to the stem elongation in the biennial world. So in celery, Swiss chard, beets, cabbage, the plants look totally different. And if you're going to grow them and save seed from them, growing them as biennials, then you have to kind of include some extra planting in there in your planting so that they're going to have enough space to grow as the full size plant to reach maturity. And most of our annual and biennial plants are only going to flower and fruit once before they senesce and die. It's a hard knock life for these plants. The perennials, of course, live many years. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are reproductive for many years. In fact, most perennials are going to really take several years to get to the reproductive cycle. So they're growing vegetatively, both in the roots and the shoots, for several years before they get enough energy to produce reproductively. And of course, we could think of that as, trees or just herbaceous perennials as well. Of course, the herbaceous perennials die back to the ground. Our woody perennials continue to grow on that same tissue. And we have these different growth curves for different growth cycles, whether it's rapid or slow growing species. As I mentioned earlier, many of the tropical and subtropical, especially the herbaceous ornamental plants, are grown as annuals anywhere that we have cold winters, which is throughout the mid-Atlantic. In the woody perennial plants, the shoot and root systems are going to remain alive until really they've kind of they all have a kind of determined life cycle, an average, life expectancy. But that's going to be determined by the genes, the genetics, as well as the environment. So in all of these cases, really, not just in the woody plants, but in all plants, we look at both the genotype and the phenotype. So the genotype is its actual DNA and what it says the plant is supposed to be, the actual directions coded by the genes that are inside of the chromosomes. The phenotype is how those genes are kind of turned off or on by the environment itself. So it's genetics plus environmental factors that make it appear to us as how the plant actually looks. So it's a combination of both of those in herbaceous and woody plants. And an example of changes with the phenotype could just be amount of water. If a plant gets the amount of water it needs, say it's growing in moist soil, then it's larger than if it's growing in dry soil. So the genotype says how big it will get, whether it's determinate or indeterminate, and then the phenotype is actually what allows it to get to that size. And I think that is a good spot to stop and ask if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns. If you have any gripes or grievances, then just file them with Tom.
I know how to do a Gmail filter, so I can forward them to you.
The new mail filter, Ben's grievances. There could be a lot of those. So
Yes.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and sign off, and we'll see you Wednesday, and I'll try to get up at least the review for the midterm exam by then. Hope you all have a great day. Enjoy the rest of this day, and we'll see you Wednesday.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
See ya.